okay. You're all right. Now it's official. Thank you, Torin. Now we feel official. Yeah, I always make a joke about that, and so now he can officially start us there. And so, as I said, our vast nationwide viewing audience, they'll appreciate that. And we were in Tulsa yesterday for Elliot's birthday party, and so I know Elliot and Isabella watch the videos. So everybody say happy birthday, Elliot.
Happy birthday, Elliot.
Okay. All right. And so happy birthday, Elliot. All right. So today's Father's Day. I wanted to read something from John's Gospel, chapter 17, starting with the first verse. And just to give you the context, I always think it's helpful when we know what the context is. I mean, there's nothing wrong with finding a verse that you like and getting something out of it, but you know, if you really want to understand what's being communicated, the context always helps. So what's going on is, this is an event that we call the Last Supper, where Jesus met with his disciples for one last time before he was parted from them and taken away and arrested and then finally to the cross. And beginning in chapter 14, he starts giving them final instructions and communicating final thoughts to them. And that goes from chapter 14, 15, and 16. And he tells them that he will be leaving them, and he says things like, let not your heart be troubled, you believe in God, believe also in me. He's comforting them, he's encouraging them, but at the same time he's informing them that he will be taken away from them, and then he tells them to wait for the Holy Spirit, which will come, and he calls the Holy Spirit another comforter, another helper, liking the Holy Spirit's role to his own. And then finally, when we come to chapter 17, when he was finished talking to the disciples, in chapter 17, where we are now in verse 1, he begins to pray, and it's a long, chapter-long prayer. And it's interesting in this prayer because he prays for them, but he not only prays for them, but he prays for us. Sitting here today in this prayer, he says, I pray not only for them, but for those who will believe on me through their words. And that includes all of us who believe in him because they communicated what they knew and what they had received, which is kind of an interesting thing. He's right in the text, he's looking forward or looking ahead in time to those who will believe in him because of these disciples. But I want to call something to your attention. In particular, I'm going to start with verse 1. John chapter 17, verse 1. These words spake Jesus and lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father, the hour is come, glorify thy Son, that thy Son may glorify thee, as thou hast given him power over all flesh, that he should give eternal life to as many as thou hast given him. And this is life eternal, that they may know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. I have glorified thee on the earth. I have finished the work which thou gavest me to do. And now, O Father, glorify thou me with thine own self, with the glory which I had with thee before the world was. Now notice verse 6. He says, I have manifested thy name. He says, I have manifested thy name unto the men which thou gavest me out of the world. Thine they were, and thou gavest them me, and they have kept my word. Notice he said, I have manifested thy name. Now, I don't want to read the entire chapter, although we could. It's all very interesting and helpful, but I want to skip down to the end. I just want one little point out of this. Verse 25, when he is concluding, the last two verses. So we're going to skip down to verse 25 as the prayer concludes. He says, O righteous Father, the world hath not known thee. That's an interesting thought. Let me just stop right there. It says, the world hath not known thee. And the only thing I want to observe here is, it's not like Jesus has come into a world in which there's no knowledge of God. He has come specifically to the nation of Israel, who had a covenant with God and voluminous messages through the prophets and through Moses and through David and others. Yet he says, the world has not known thee. That's an interesting thing that he points out here. The world hath not known thee, but I have known thee. and these have known that thou hast sent me. And again, verse 26, notice what he says. I have declared unto them thy name, and will declare it, that the love wherewith thou hast loved me may be in them, and I in them. Now, I think it's interesting that 2 times in this chapter he makes a point of saying, I have manifested thy name, and he said, the world doesn't know you, but I know you, and I have declared unto them thy name. And I don't think it's a matter of semantics. I don't think it's just a matter of using the correct name. But I do think it's instructive. I think here's something to observe. Jesus does not, throughout the Gospels, he doesn't refer to God using the normal name for God that is used throughout the Old Testament. National Israel knew him as Jehovah. Jesus almost never calls him that. And he makes a big point of emphasizing the fact that I have manifested thy name, and I have declared unto them thy name. And almost exclusively, the only name Jesus ever applies to God is Father. And in this very prayer, we read it several times. That's the name that Jesus uses or manifests. Or I think it's interesting that he says the world hasn't known. We could say it this way. Let me paraphrase. The world doesn't really know what you're really like. But I know what you're really like, and I have revealed it to them. And what he reveals to us is that God is the Father. That's the name he uses. And again, I don't think it's a question of semantics. It's not like we're casting magic spells and we have to get the wording just right. It's a matter of what does it mean. Jesus calls God Father. When they asked him, teach us to pray, in a couple of the Gospels record that, he said, when you pray, say, and you know how it goes, Our Father. That's how what we call the Lord's Prayer begins. Right here in these chapters where he's discussing with the disciples the fact that he's going to be departed from them, one of the disciples said, well, since you're leaving us, I'm paraphrasing, show us the Father and then we'll be satisfied. And he said, Philip, I've been so long with you and you didn't know me. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Meaning that if you see me, Jesus, you see what God is really like. And what he's like is, and he likens God, and he uses the name Father. God is like a father. And when we think about what is a father like, well, a father is, of course, one who gives life to his children. He's the source of their life. That's one thing. Then the other thing is he's an example for them. And then another thing is he provides for them. He looks out for them. And Jesus, I believe, is in emphasizing this, is trying to get across to the disciples and to us who believe on him because of their word. God is like a father. He's given you life. He looks out for you. He provides for you. He cares about you. And he's an example, a good example for you to follow. On the point of him providing for us, this is one of the things Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, ask and you'll receive. Seek and you shall find. Knock and the door will be open to you. And then he says to explain to them, which of you who is a father, if you have a son that asks for a piece of bread, will you give him a stone? Well, that's a rhetorical question. The answer, of course, is no. And he said, if he asks for a fish, will you give him a snake? Well, and he even says, he says, those of you who are fathers, think about this. In other words, is God giving you, is he sending bad things to you? Is he doing hurtful things? No, he's not like that. He says, then he concludes that little discussion by saying, if you then being evil, that's what the King James translation says, you could say it this way, not necessarily evil, but maybe so, even a parent, even the worst kind of parent takes care of his children to some degree. But I think a better way to understand it is if you being human or natural or just ordinary human beings, if you know how to take care of your children, don't you think God at least is as good as you are? That's the point he's making. he's trying to get across to the disciples and to us that God is a loving and a caring and a providing Father. That's the true nature of God. That's what He's truly like. But I think out of all the teachings of Jesus, and again, if you're looking for this, you'll notice it's everywhere. He's constantly referring to God. When He prays and when He talks about God, He constantly uses the expression Father to describe Him. I think the most descriptive and the most enlightening passage in which Jesus teaches us what the true nature of God is like by likening Him to a father is found in Luke's Gospel and chapter 15. And this is a very familiar passage. And I think we put the wrong spin on it, or the wrong title on it. This is Luke. Let me get it right. Luke chapter 15, starting with verse 11. We call this the parable of the prodigal son. But it's really not the parable of the prodigal son. It's the parable of what's God really like. Because the true thing he's trying to get across is he wants to explain, and he's using the illustration of these two different sons to show what the true nature of God is. And just to give you a background, and the point he's trying to make in it, in the beginning of the chapter, Torrin, I guess I gave you verse 11. Go back to chapter 15, verse 1. Same chapter, verse 1. And let's get the context. It says, "Then drew near unto him all the publicans and the sinners for to hear him." Of course, publicans, it's the publicans and sinners. If you look into this word publican, usually what we say is, well, that's the tax collectors. But, it's a little deeper than that. The publicans, the reason they call them that in the King James translation is when the King James translators set out to translate the word that is used for publican, the closest thing they could come up with is a person who runs a public house or a tavern or an inn. And so at a tavern in it's 1600s England, the tavern is a place where people would gather and they would drink there, and there was carousing going on, and you could spend the night there, you could get a meal there. It was like a gathering place. And also, since people gathered there, it was a place where taxes were often collected at the public house. And so when the King James translators came to this word, they said, well, call them publicans, meaning a person who is running a tavern. And because of the clientele that you might expect to find at a drinking establishment, these are maybe not the highest moral character of individuals. And in first century Israel, they were collecting taxes for the Romans, and so they were especially hated by everyone else. So you might say the down and outers and the lower class and the people who were regarded as, you might say, not good examples of godliness. Let's just say it that way. Not people you would assume to be righteous when we're talking about the publicans and sinners. And it says that these people drew near to Jesus to hear him. Now that's kind of remarkable in and of itself. That makes me think that there was something about Jesus that at least didn't alienate them. And as a matter of fact, not only did he not alienate them, there was something about him that positively attracted them to him. So evidently Jesus wasn't standing up and condemning them and calling out their bad behavior and their sins and making them feel bad, because in that case they would stay away, just like anybody would. Like when we went to Bible school, Kenneth Hagin was the head of the school there at Rhema Bible Training Center, and he was one of our main teachers. And there was an expression he used, a little figure of speech. He says, even a pig will quit coming to the trough if you hit him on the head with a board every time he comes up to eat. I thought that's a good point. What he's saying is if you're going to condemn people and point out their faults and their failures and their sins, well, no wonder people don't want to come to church. See, and these people, these publicans and sinners, they weren't running away from Jesus. They weren't hiding from him. They were drawing near to him. So evidently there was something about him that caused them to go to him. It's not like they were perfect people, but evidently they sensed in him. Here's what I liken it to. They were attracted to Jesus in the same way that if you're sick, you're attracted to the doctor. Because he's got what you need to make you better. You understand? If you're unwell, you want to go to the doctor because he's got what you need to make you feel better, to fix what's wrong. And I think that's why the publicans and the sinners drew near to hear him. But verse 2 says, excuse me, the Pharisees and the scribes. Now, on the one hand, we have the publicans and the sinners, people regarded as practicing unrighteous things, unrighteous reputation. On the other hand, we have the scribes and the Pharisees, who are regarded as holy and righteous, and outwardly they seem to be doing the things that righteous, holy people would do. They fast, they are giving tithes, they're doing all these things that would, from outward appearances make you say, well, these are righteous people while those others are sinners. That's the Pharisees and the scribes. They murmured when they saw that the publicans and the sinners were drawing near to Jesus. Murmured means they talked, like behind their hand, and they gossiped, they spoke ill of them. They murmured, they complained, you might say, saying, and here's what they said about Jesus. They were upset with Jesus. They said, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." I don't know which is worse. He receives them, and then that really offended them. Pharisees are kind of like that. That for them that was a mark of holiness, that you didn't rub shoulders with unholy people. Jesus, and I underlined that in my Bible. Yes, he receives sinners. That's right. That's one thing about him. But they were offended by that. They said, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So, as I said before, what this paints a picture of for me is, as I explained to you, the word that is translated publican, picture a person who's running a tavern or an inn. Like in England, they have a lot of those. We don't have those so much here, but people gather there. There's drinking going on. There's music. There's talking, a lot of laughing, and social activity. And what I picture is Jesus going to a place like that and sitting down with these people in that kind of environment, and they're gathering around him, and he's talking with them. And not the kind of scene that the Pharisees and the scribes considered to be a place for a holy person to be. Because he said, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So he was evidently there eating with them. And to me, I don't picture like a church dinner with a big white tablecloth and the church fellowship hall. I picture him at the tavern sitting down. And that might offend you, but you don't want to be like the scribes and Pharisees, because they were offended by this. So Jesus then begins, he knows what's going on, that the Pharisees and the scribes are offended, and he begins by giving some parables. And here's the first one. Let's just read one. Verse 3 says, he spoke this parable to them. In other words, he addresses their offense and their murmuring. And here's his first parable. "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, doth not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after that which is lost till he find it?" Now we understand what he's saying. Keep in mind, when Jesus is making parables, he's making up stories to make an illustration, to make a point. He goes after the one that's lost until he finds it. He leaves the 99 in the wilderness. And then he goes after the one that's lost. And verse 5 says, "And when he has found it, he layeth it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he cometh home, he calleth together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, Rejoice with me." Rejoice means, let's be happy. That's what it means. Celebrate. "For I have found my sheep which was lost." So, he's likening the scribes and Pharisees who are standing off at a distance murmuring. He says, the 99, he leaves them in the wilderness. In other words, these scribes and Pharisees who feel like they are holy in their own eyes, I'm going to leave you in the wilderness. And I'm going to go to this one who's lost and knows he's lost. And with the one who's lost and knows he's lost, when I make connection with him, he goes on my shoulders. And we all rejoice. and we're celebrating. So the question is, where would you rather be, in the wilderness or on his shoulders? Well, that's the difference he makes. Then he has another parable, verse 7. I say unto you likewise, joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than the 99 just persons which need no repentance. I believe he's saying this in a kind of a sarcastic way, because he knows that these Pharisees are not as just as they appear. In Matthew's gospel, he called them hypocrites because they appear outwardly righteous, but on the inside, their attitudes are wrong. So here's another parable, verse 8. Either what woman, having 10 pieces of silver, if she lose one piece, doth not light a candle and sweep the house and seek diligently till she find it? And when she hath found it, she calleth her neighbors and saying, her neighbors together, saying, Rejoice with me, for I have found the piece that was lost. Likewise, I say unto you, there's joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth. So what he's evidently addressing is, when he's hanging out here with these sinners and tax collectors and publicans, evidently there was rejoicing going, or there was celebrating going on, and that offended these Pharisees. And he's trying to liken it to, listen, these are the people that they come to me and their hearts are changed, is what he's saying. And then he comes up with another story. He's trying to get the point across about what's happening and trying to touch these Pharisees with the reality. And this is the one I want to read now, because I think this is a story that we call it the story of the prodigal son, but think about the role of the father. Now keep in mind, this is not a true account of real people. This is a made-up story. And so Jesus is making up the characters and using this made-up story to illustrate the point. And one thing he's trying to illustrate is, keep in mind we have these two groups. We have the sinners and the publicans, and then we have the scribes and the Pharisees, and they got a bad attitude about the sinners and the publicans. But then in the story there's the Father, and the Father represents God. Now Jesus, remember in that prayer, he said, I have manifested thy name. He said, the world hath not known thee, but I have known thee. I think the bigger point he's trying to make in this story is he's trying to show us what the nature of God is truly like, what the nature of the Father is really like. So verse 11 says, a certain man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided to them his living. Now, right away, we see that this son he's violating norms and customs. You don't inherit what your parents have while they're still alive. I mean, this is bad taste, if nothing else, to go to your parents and say, I want my inheritance right now. And not only that, he's the younger son. Ordinarily, in this period of time, the older son inherits everything. That's the way it worked. The older son would inherit the land and the property, and then the younger sons. That's why in the Middle Ages, the older son would inherit the castle and the lands, and then the younger sons would go off and be a knight and go off on adventures and things. But this younger son, he comes to the father and says, I want my inheritance right now. So there's 2 things wrong with that. You're not supposed to go and ask for your inheritance while the parent is still alive. Number 2, he's the younger son. So Jesus is deliberately showing us that this younger son is all wrong. His attitude's wrong. He's doing the wrong thing. But that's not the end of the wrongdoing of this younger son. Verse 13 says, not many days after, the younger son gathered all together. That means all of this inheritance from his father. And that's what he gathered together. And took his journey into a far country. And there he wasted his substance with riotous living. Now keep in mind, Jesus is making up this story, and so he's characterizing it this way. It's not that the son said, okay, Father, loan me some money, I'm going to go make some investments, and well, the investments didn't turn out right, and No, he didn't go make some investments. He wasn't doing honorable things with the money. He wasted it. Jesus said he wasted it. He squandered it. He's making this son out to be everything wrong. He's making him as wrong can be. He wasted, he squandered his substance with riotous living. Now, I don't know about you, but in my everyday life, I never say riotous living. Riotous is not part of my vocabulary. What we would say in the modern day is with partying, with wild partying. Now, when I say it that way, you get the idea. He wasted, not only did he, in an unjust way, ask for his inheritance while the father was still alive, but then he wouldn't waste it. He just blew it. He spent it all. It wasn't, that he, made some bad choices. He spent it all, not bad investments. He wasted it on riotous living, on wild living. And you can, imagine whatever you want about what that means. But verse 14 says, when he spent all, in other words, he blew it all. He got this money from his father, and then he went out and blew it all. He spent all. Then it says, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. It's kind of ironic. That's kind of the way these things work. He didn't have anything left, and he'd wasted it all. So verse 15 says, he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. And he, the citizen of that country, sent him into the fields to feed swine. Now, if you're a Jewish person, I mean, even today this would be offensive, but I mean in first century Israel, pigs are unclean. And so if you've got to go out and feed the pigs and feed the swine, I remember when, that always makes me think of this. When Elizabeth was very small, we were driving out to, a dance lesson or gymnastics or something. We drove by the fairgrounds and we saw there's this building that said cattle. And I said to her, what do you think's in there? She says, cows. And then we come to another building that said swine. And I said, what do you think's in there? She said, swans. So, no, swine is not plural for swans. Swine is pigs. And so he's there feeding pigs. So he is not only, and it's not like it's not his fault. It's all his fault. And Jesus, again, is making up this story. And so he's found himself in dire situation. And he's out in the fields feeding the swine, and it's even worse than that. Verse 16 says, he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. That means he's looking at the food that he's feeding the pigs, the swine, and saying, I wish I could have some of that. Now listen, you are in a bad situation if you're looking at what pigs are eating and you're getting hungry and wanting to eat that. You are in desperate straits. Now, this is a very interesting thing that he says here, this expression in verse 17. Now, we use this expression too, and so we kind of read over it. It says, when he came to himself. But just think what those words mean, apart from the fact that that's an expression, that he came to himself. He came to himself. In other words, if I said, I came to church, that means I left my house and I came to church. So he came to himself. Now, what does that mean to you? To me, that means when it says he came to himself, something it's like in the cartoons you see the little light bulb goes off. Something dawned on him. He began to see things he hadn't previously, or understand things or perceive things in a way that he did not previously understand or perceive them. And what he began to understand and perceive was something about himself. He came to himself. Well, what did he realize when he came to himself? He said, how many hired servants of my father? What he came to when he came to himself was he remembered or perceived, or it dawned on him, wait a minute, I am the child of my father. Even though he had done everything wrong, and Jesus deliberately made it this way in this made-up story. He had him do everything wrong. There's not anything he did right. He did everything wrong. But he came to himself and he said, how many hired servants of my father? He remembers his father. Now, did you notice, by the way, in what we've read so far, you don't see anything about the father getting mad. You don't see anything about the father getting angry. You don't see anything about the father threatening the son. You don't see anything about the father who represents God doing any of the things that some people assume God is like. In other words, when Jesus said he took what he got from the father and he went and wasted it with riotous living, you don't see the father saying, I'll tell you one thing, you're going to get what's coming to you. That's how people think God is like. Vindictive, retribution, give you what's coming to you. You know, if he wanted to make it be that way, he could have told it that way, but he doesn't. See, the Father didn't get upset, the Father didn't get mad, the Father didn't get angry, but here the Son has come to a realization about himself, and he says, how many servants of my Father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? Verse 18 says, I will arise and go to my Father. You know what he's thinking to himself, you know what, in my Father's house, when I was with my Father, you know, He took care of me. There was bread enough. He provided for me. There was enough of everything. And he's thinking to himself, I'm imagining, how did I get this idea in my mind that something out here away from the Father with this riotous living, that's what I need. Because here in this close relationship with my Father, in fellowship with my Father, in my Father's house, He provides for me. And now he says in verse 18, he makes a decision. He says, I will arise and go to my Father, and will say to Him. Now listen to this. Listen to what he's got a plan here. He says, I have sinned against heaven and before Thee. That's point number 1. Verse 19 says, and I am no more worthy to be called Thy Son. You see, when he came to himself, he realized that even in his condition, even in his situation in which he was experiencing everything that was bad, he said, I'm still the Son of my Father. He's still my Father. And I will arise and go to my Father. And first thing is, he's going to say, I have sinned against heaven and before Thee. Point number 2 in his prepared speech, verse 19, I am no more worthy to be called Thy Son. Number 3, make me as one of Thy hired servants. So he's got a 3-point speech figured out. I have sinned against heaven and before Thee. I am no more worthy to be called Thy Son. Make me as one of Thy hired servants. So, verse 20 says, He arose and came to His Father. Now, here's the part that I think Jesus wants to get across. Now, His audience here is the sinners and the publicans who have drawn near to hear Him, on the one hand, and the scribes and the Pharisees who are critical of Him, on the other hand. And to all of them, He wants them to understand what the nature of God is really like. Here's when He describes the Father. This is the first time the Father comes into the story since the beginning, since the Son went off and did everything wrong. When He was yet a great way off, His Father saw Him and had compassion, not anger, not retribution, not vindictive, not crossed His arms and drummed His fingers on the table and said, I'll tell you what, you're going to be in the doghouse and you think you're going to come crawling back here again. No, nothing like that. It says the Father saw Him a great way off and had compassion. And not only that, He didn't just say sitting on the porch fuming and mad. He's not fuming and mad at all. It said He saw Him a great way off and had compassion, and He ran. That's the Father. He ran and fell on His neck and kissed Him. Now that's an image of God you don't get every day. Jesus is saying this is what the Father is really like. This is the true nature of God. If you want to know what His personality is like, if you want to know what His nature is, you want to know what who He really is, the person that is at his worst, He looks at them with compassion and He runs toward them. And it says He fell on His neck and kissed Him. Now the Son, remember He had a 3-point speech. So He starts in with the speech. Here's the Father. He's run to meet Him. He fell on His neck and kissed Him. The Son stops Him and says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in Thy sight. That's point number 1. I am no more worthy to be called Thy Son. That's point number 2. Remember, there's 3 points. He was going to say, make me as one of Thy hired servants. But evidently the Father was not interested in hearing these remarks from the Son, because He interrupts Him. Before he can even finish his speech, the Father said to His servants, He interrupted him before he could even get it all out. It's almost, He gives you the impression that God, He's not interested in hearing all this, let me tell you how bad I am talking. All He cares about is the Son He's come back. We think sometimes God wants to hear us groveling, and confessing everything that there ever was to confess. He doesn't get any pleasure out of that. He doesn't care about any of that. You know, I was looking at something earlier in Hebrews chapter 10, quoting from one of the Psalms. He said, in burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou hast had no pleasure. He's not interested in that. He's interested in relationship, in a love relationship. So here, the Father interrupted him. Before he could even get those 3 points out of his mouth, the Father interrupted him. And he said to his servants, bring forth the best robe. Not the worst robe, the best robe. Put it on him. Put a ring on his hand. The ring represents that you are in the standing of the Father. It's like a sign of royalty. It's like you have the, when the people see that you've got the ring on your hand, it means that they see that you are acting in the authority of your Father. So bring forth the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet. And bring hither the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. That's the Father who represents God in this story. In other words, instead of being sad and all this groveling and and crying, enough with that. Let us eat and be merry. And here's the point. Here's his attitude. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to be merry. Now see, the reason I think Jesus is telling this is, I think that's what was happening as he was socializing with the sinners and the publicans. They were being merry. That's a image of Jesus we don't often have. There was laughing going on. You know what being merry means? I mean, on social occasions, maybe when you get together with your family and there's a lot of laughing and everybody's happy. And I noticed yesterday we were at, for Elliot's birthday, we went to this place where it's a restaurant where they let you play board games. And so they have these big tables, and they have every board game there ever was, every tabletop game. And so we were all sitting there, and they bring you a meal, and so you eat, and you're playing board games, and all this laughing, and everybody's having a good time. I picture that sort of like what's happening here with Jesus. They're being merry, I don't know what board game they were playing, but what board game would Jesus play? Okay, but they were being merry. And you see what his attitude, he's saying this is what God's attitude is. This is the true nature of God. But the story's not over. Remember, there's the sinners and the publicans who drew near to Jesus, and he's sitting there with them being merry. And he says they're like this son who, even though they did everything wrong, even though they squandered it, they have turned around and they've come to themselves and said, you know what, I can be in a right relationship with my Father. And Jesus is saying this is what the Father's attitude is towards them. But now the elder son, verse 25, that represents the scribes and the Pharisees. Remember, they were murmuring. They were standing off at a distance with their arms folded, murmuring. This man receives sinners and eats with them. That's what they said. The elder son represents them. The elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. Again, that tells me that what was happening here where Jesus was hanging out with these publicans and sinners, there was probably music and dancing going on, because he says it in his parable. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. Now, this older brother, instead of saying, well, isn't that great? I can't wait to go see him. I'm so happy. No, verse 28 says, he was angry. Now listen to me. The only person angry in this parable is this self-righteous older brother. That's the only, God wasn't angry, the Father wasn't angry. Nobody's angry except this one self-righteous older brother who thought he was better than his son, the wastrel. He was angry, and he would not go in. Now Jesus is saying, you scribes and you Pharisees, that's what you're like. You're angry and you won't come in. In other words, I'd like for you to come in, but you won't. You're standing off at a distance. You won't come in. He wants them to come in, but they won't. It's not his fault, it's their fault. So the father went out and entreated him. That means he begged him. He went out to reason with him and begged him. And he answered and said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment. And yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son, you notice he doesn't say my brother. He doesn't even claim any ownership or relationship at all. This thy son, in other words, he's nobody to me, he's your son. This thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots. Now I just have to point out, I never read about any harlots in the story. Did you? I read it pretty carefully. Where'd the harlots come from? Well, they were in the mind of this older brother, who was boasting about how I never did anything wrong, but in parentheses, I was sure thinking about it. Well, I'll be the only one that laughs at that. I thought that was kind of funny. Which hath devoured thy living with harlots. In other words, how did he know? Well, he's imagining in his mind. Thou hast killed the fatted calf for him. And he said, Son, thou art ever with me. All I have is thine. But it was meet. That means appropriate. It was proper, appropriate that we should make merry and be glad. For this thy brother was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. So he's showing us what the true nature of God is like. He's not angry. He wants a relationship of happiness and joy and rejoicing. And he's pleased and happy and excited with anyone who will turn their heart towards him and enter into a relationship with him, because he's not demanding anything. He's not strict or mean or harsh or cruel or vindictive. He wants to have a loving, like a family relationship with all of us. Okay, I think that's all we got today. Let's all stand up and we'll conclude.